You step out into a Pacific night that is ordinary enough for work. No fanfare, no speech. Above you, uncountable points of light balance on the horizon lines in quiet ranks. You're not looking for romance. You're looking for a particular star and the way it behaves at this latitude. You've been taught that names matter because names anchor use. So you whisper the name as you scan the sky. Hokulea, Arcturus, the star of gladness, the one that rides near the top of the sky for Hawaii, passing high overhead and telling you something simple but essential about where you are in the world. In Hawaiian practice, it is a guiding zenith star for this latitude, an ordinary astronomical fact turned into a dependable tool. You learn to approach this in the least dramatic way possible. Stand on deck, feel for the swell beneath your heels, and mark the rhythms of wind and canvas. Then, in that working calm, you check how Hokulea climbs and crosses. Its arc does not give you a full position like an instrument would. It gives you confidence that you are sailing in the band of ocean where this star belongs high, not low. If it rides too low to the south or north, you know you've been sliding away from the latitude you mean to hold. It is a check, a quiet correction, and it fits into a larger system you keep in your head, the star compass, where the horizon is divided into named houses, and each bright star rises and sets by a known door. This mental layout is not poetry, but procedure. Your teachers make the compass concrete by language. East is Hikina, the arriving horizon. West is Komohana, the entering horizon. Between them, the circle is partitioned into repeating named sectors, houses, so you can speak the sea the way you speak a village map. You might not carry a sextant, but you carry syllables, and each syllable is tied to a direction that your body can feel. When a star comes to the rail of the world at a known house, you know which way your bow should point. The discipline is mostly memory and mostly ordinary. You rehearse on land with chalked circles. You rehearse on the canoe with the real wind. You rehearse while cooking and while coiling rope. Your instructor walks you around the circle, asks you the rising house of this star, the setting house of that one, and waits for a plain answer. There is no trick and no shortcut. To carry the sea on your tongue, you learn lists. The sequence of bright stars as they rise along the east, the same as they enter along the west, and the way they trade places through the seasons. The work is repetitive by design. It makes your mind quiet, and quiet minds tend to notice when a light appears half a house too far north. Hokulea becomes your baseline example when you teach children because it embodies several ideas at once. First, it is bright enough to spot quickly even when the sky is busy. Second, at Hawaii's latitude it travels high, so its behaviour is memorable. Third, its name ties it to a voyaging canoe that generations now know by sight. People learn better when a concept is connected to an object, and the canoe named Hokulea has sailed enough miles to make the star harder to forget. In lessons, you point both ways. The canoe takes its name from the star, and the star's name stays fresh because the canoe keeps sailing. You keep your expectations modest. The star compass is not a miracle, it is a way to structure attention. If clouds appear and the sky is gone, the method does not fail. It hands work to other senses. You step down a layer to the constant motions of the ocean, the long swell trains that outlast local winds and roll straight from distant storms. You feel the direction of the dominant swell in your thighs and the small cross swell in your ribs. If you have been steering east by a particular rising star house, you can continue to hold that line by riding the aligned swell when the stars vanish. In training, you spend time closing your eyes and calling the swell directions aloud. Again, not dramatic, just practice, so that on a real night you can steer without complaint. On clear nights, Hokulea is part of a web, not a lone beacon. You pair it with other bright points so the failure of one does not ruin the shift. Maybe you align Hokulea with Hokupea Polaris, when visible low in the north, a fixed light that hardly moves. In Hawaii, it is not as high as in temperate latitudes, but it is present enough to confirm north and to anchor the compass. When it sits where it should, your mind relaxes by a degree, and you can check the canoe's sounds instead of the horizon. You're not chasing romance, you're collecting clues. Because names travel with culture, you take time to show students that the same cluster can carry different responsibilities in different places. Matariki, the Pleiades, tells Maori communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, more than a direction. Its first winter rising marks the new year and connects to food planning and remembrance, a timing function more than a steering one. In your voiceover notes, you point out that a navigator's sky is a calendar and a compass at once, and that communities thread their lives to the heavens in locally sensible ways. The details are not glamorous, but they are how real households schedule work. When you return to Hokulea specifically, you constrain the story to what can be taught and checked. You trace the path. It rises in a known house, climbs to a known height relative to the canoe's crossbeam, and sets at the corresponding house on the entering horizon. You keep a running log in your head: time of rising, approximate height when the wind shifted, time when the cross swell started to bite from port. If a younger crew member asks why you are so methodical, you remind them that the Pacific is too large for hunches. A light 5 degrees off tonight becomes a reef missed by 30 miles by dawn. The star's name keeps you attentive because every name in this system implies a record of use. The revival of this method in modern decades is sometimes discussed with excitement, but your training keeps it plain. The Polynesian Voyaging Society deliberately rebuilt practice so that language, canoes, and routes would survive. The canoe Hokulea became a floating classroom, and Nainoa Thompson formalised a Hawaiian star compass based on teachings from Master Navigator Mau Piailug. The process includes memorising roughly 200 stars and their rising and setting points, a figure that terrifies no one once you realise it is just lists and constant rehearsal. The method is contemporary in the sense that it lives again, but it is traditional in how it demands repetition and community. You address a common misconception with the same steady tone. This is not mystical, it is observational. You do not need to mythologise the sky to make it useful. You only need to keep your eyes open over many nights, record what happens, and pass it on as talk that others can verify. If you call Hokulea a zenith star for Hawaii, someone else can stand on deck and see how high it runs there. If you say it rises in a certain house in May, a second person can check again next year. What makes it beautiful is not a story layered on top, but the accuracy that lets food, families and islands meet each other on time. At this point, your audience may want a technical aside and you offer it quietly. A star house is a wedge of the horizon with a name. Some traditions count roughly 32 such points, mapping to winds and bearings. The Hawaiian compass divides the circle with Hawaiian terms that repeat in each quadrant, reinforcing memory. You can practice on land by standing in the centre of a drawn circle and pointing to the houses as an elder calls out star names. On water, your body replaces the chalk, shoulders squaring to the swell, knees soft to read the irregularities, eyes walking the dome of sky in a slow circuit. The procedure looks like stillness from a distance, but it is active attention. Different archipelagos maintain their own lexicons. In Tahitian sources you read about rua fetu, star pits, or houses, organised by azimuth, a reminder that the idea of partitioning the horizon is Pacific-wide even as the names change. If you sail east to the Tuamotus, you hear terms that are cousins to your own, and you discover that agreement at sea is reached not by force but by shared observation. The star rose there, we all saw it. The naming is conservative because navigation does not reward novelty for its own sake. It rewards what gets canoes safely to land. On some voyages you pair sky and mind with a different construct learned from Micronesian neighbours. Itak, a way of thinking where, out of sight of land, you imagine a side island sliding along the horizon as if the canoe were still. You keep track of progress as that. Imaginary island moves, and when it reaches a known bearing from your destination, you know you are near. The method does not change the stars. It changes the story you tell yourself to keep bearings in order. Even if you do not formally use a tech in Polynesia, knowing it sharpens your sense that navigation is a cognitive craft as much as a physical one. Back on deck, the night resumes its ordinary pace. Hokulea rises where it should. The swell remains aligned with your plan. A young crewmate asks whether the name Star of Gladness makes the canoe lucky. You shake your head. The name makes the canoe accountable. If Hokulea is a known thing at a known place, then your steering and your teaching can be judged against it. The older you get, the more you like tools that can be checked by others. The ocean is full of stories. The ones that keep children alive are the ones other hands can repeat. Now you widen the frame. If you were in Aotearoa in midwinter, Matariki's first dawn appearance would tie you to seasonal food work. Stores counted, ground prepared, families gathered. If you were farther north, Hokupea would sit higher, and you could lean more on that fixed point. But here, at Hawaii, Hokulea is the most comfortable teacher because it climbs high enough to be unmistakable, and it ties your island names to the sky in a way that a beginner can hold. Each longitude and latitude writes its own practical syllabus. In closing this first section, you return to the plainest truth. A navigator's skill is the product of thousands of uneventful checks. You look up, you say the name, you confirm the house. You adjust the steering sweep by a finger width, and you carry on. If clouds come, you feel the swell. If birds rise at dawn and fly a certain way, you revise your estimate of distance to land. Tools are humble and layered. The star is one layer, the ocean another, the birds and clouds additional. Hokulea sits in that stack not as a hero, but as a reliable co-worker who never misses a watch. You end the night with a small habit that keeps memory alive. You speak the name one more time and match it to a direction you can point at with your hand. You note the hour in your head and the feel of the hull underfoot. You file the details away not because you love details, but because families sleep better when canoes arrive on schedule. And that, in the end, is what these names are for. Unresolved thought. If a single named star can hold a latitude steady in your mind, what happens when you knit 200 such names into a circle? How fine can your steering become? And how quietly can an ocean be crossed when every point of light has a job? You continue under a sky that works like a ledger. Plain entries, repeated nightly, valuable because they add up. You're still speaking directly to the listener, the you who stands at the gunwale counting breaths between waves. And your task tonight is to deepen the pattern behind a single name. Hokulea, Arcturus, has already been your dependable co-worker. Now you place it inside a larger routine of alignment, memory and quiet checking. How a navigator keeps a canoe on a chosen band of ocean by using a star that belongs high to Hawaii and companions that rise and set in an order you can recite. Arcturus is called the Star of Gladness in Hawaiian and is known within voyaging circles as a zenith star for Hawaii because it tracks very near overhead at these latitudes. That simple astronomical fact turns into a low-drama, high-value cue for latitude keeping on long crossings. The first deepening is conceptual, latitude without numbers. In instrument navigation, you might speak of degrees and minutes. In wayfinding, you carry behaviour. A zenith star's behaviour at your island's latitude becomes a yes-no test your body can apply in seconds. If Hokulea is travelling high, so high you have to tip your chin to see it, it tells you you're still inside the latitudinal corridor you intend to hold when sailing to or from Hawaii. If one night it rides uncomfortably low, you do not panic. You ask whether wind or current has quietly pushed you north or south, and you correct by a finger's width of helm. Nothing here is mystical. It is observation accumulated and passed forward. The second deepening is structural, the star compass. You picture the sea's rim as a circle divided into named houses, labelled bearings where stars come out of the ocean, rise, and go back into the ocean, set. The Hawaiian system taught by Nainoa Thompson formalises this construct so that each significant star has an expected rising and setting house. If you can name a star and recall its houses, you can steer by it at the start of night, and again at the end, staying inside your intended lane even if clouds cover the hours in between. The compass is not a carving or a dial, it is a language map of the horizon that you memorise through drills. Drills are deliberately unromantic. On land, you stand inside a chalked circle and point to where Hokulea should rise, to where it should set, and to the houses for its supporting cast. On water, you perform the same motions with your eyes and shoulders while the canoe moves. The repetition fixes sequences in your mouth, a rising list in the east, a setting list in the west, and the cross-checks that tie them. Your teacher calls a name at random and waits while you point, then another name, another point. If you stumble, you repeat the sequence as if you were reciting a times table. The effect is to make the sky predictable enough that a small anomaly, a star a house farther north than expected, rings like a bell and prompts a correction. You place Hokulea among other reliable cues. Hokupea, Polaris, is low from Hawaii but present, close to fixed, and settles the direction of north when the lower sky is clear. Matariki, the Pleiades, matters in other ways across the Pacific, including among Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where its first winter rising before dawn marks the new year and ties sky-watching to calendars of work and remembrance. The point for a navigator is not to memorise every culture's meanings. It is to recognise that the same lights serve different duties in different places, so you keep your own island's syllabus straight while respecting your neighbour's uses. It's the opposite of flattening. You note that a cluster that cues a season in one place might be a mid-voyage cross-check in another. If the sky goes dark behind cloud, you step down to the sea's long swells. These are not the choppy waves born this afternoon, but the slow, steady trains rolling from far storms. Their spacing and direction outlast the weather. You learn to feel one dominant swell on your thighs and a crossing swell on your ribs, and you hold your selected heading by aiming the canoe to ride the correct slope. Under certain conditions, swells even betray land. An atoll or island refracts and reflects wave energy, creating patterns that a trained helmsman can sense, especially at night when your eyes are already tuned to rhythm. In training materials, this is filed under ordinary skills, but on a live voyage it is a great comfort to steer by sea when sky vanishes. The third deepening is community. The practices that support Hokulea, the star and the canoe, survive because people have chosen to keep them alive. In the late 20th century, the Polynesian Voyaging Society rebuilt voyaging as an everyday discipline, not a museum act. The double-hulled canoe Hokulea launched in 1975 and guided first by Micronesian master wayfinder Mau Piailug, demonstrated to skeptics that purposeful non-instrument navigation could link Hawaii and Tahiti across open ocean. The canoe and its voyages became a floating classroom. Subsequent voyages, including the multi-year Moana Nui Akea expedition, continue to teach that navigation is observation refined by care. The revival is living history and has inspired parallel recoveries of knowledge across the Pacific. Mentioning Mau expands your map beyond Polynesia to Carolinian practice. Mau Piailug, trained at the Werieng School on Satawal, taught a mental tool known in Micronesia as itak, a way to track movement by holding an imagined reference island steady in your mind while you let your real destination move relative to it. You are not required to adopt the full Carolinian scheme to appreciate its elegance. The value for you is the reminder that navigation is a cognitive craft. You choose a mental frame that keeps bearings coherent over many nights. Where the Hawaiian star compass organises houses and rising lists, itak organises progress. Both are forms of attention management that make long distances tractable without instruments. You shift now to routines, because routines are what get canoes home. A watch begins with a recap: intended bearing, current swell feel, wind name, cloud types clearing or building. You speak aloud the first 3 bright bodies you expect to use. Hokulea will rise in this house. Hokapea should sit here. This belt of Orion will cross there at midnight. You also set a modest list of exceptions. If cirrus thickens, fall back to swell. If the swell chops, watch for a dawn line of birds to suggest direction to land. If both fade, reduce sail and preserve position until a fresh cue arrives. The routine is not to be brave, it is to be durable. Memory work is similarly modest and constant. You keep rising lists by season, which stars come first on the eastern horizon, in the months when winds favour certain voyages, and how high each climbs at your latitude. You pair each name with a body position, chin up, arm length, a fist above the beam, to build an internal height sense that does not pretend to be precise like an instrument, but is consistent enough to detect drift. This is where Hokulea's near-zenith passage for Hawaii helps beginners. Its very height is a mnemonic. It's either high enough to feel right or it isn't, so your brain files it under a big, easy category and saves its detail bandwidth for subtler cues. Because you are making boring history for sleep, you also include what most lectures skip: housekeeping. You place a water gourd where it can't roll, lash the bailer, and check that the steering oar lanyard is sound. A tired helmsman can lose a paddle to a single bad slap of wave. Replacing it costs minutes that can throw off a delicate star alignment during a critical check. You brush sand from a coil because grit can saw rope during a long night. You tack down a corner of matting before the wind builds. None of these chores is romantic, but they protect continuity, your ability to stay with the sky's program long enough to read it. Another unglamorous detail: logs. Traditional wayfinding did not use paper logs as a rule, but the mental log was relentless. You note in your head when Hokulea rose relative to the watch change, when the cross swell increased, when a faint land smell arrived that might be a far atoll waking under sun. If memory feels slippery, in modern training you are not scolded for making an unobtrusive written note. The purpose is not purity, but accuracy, especially on educational voyages where the lesson is the continuity of observation across generations. The boring part is the seriousness with which you record ordinary things. You widen to land finding. Stars put you in the neighbourhood. Signs point to the exact driveway. At dawn you study bird paths, terns and noddies commuting between roosting islets and feeding grounds, sketch lines that converge on land. Frigate birds, which cannot land on the water, are strong indicators when they appear in numbers. As the sun rises higher, you look at the undersides of clouds. Shallow lagoons can brighten the base of a cumulus, with a faint greenish or pale reflection, an effect you learn to distinguish from ordinary scatter. In steady trades, cloud streets form downwind of islands. Even if the island is below the horizon, a line of puffed cumulus can hint at land upwind. All of these cues are gentle, probabilistic, and therefore best read in concert. Birds, clouds, and swell refraction. Agreeing make a good case. One cue alone prompts caution. When classroom talk turns to, "How precise is this?" you answer without defensiveness. Precision belongs to the task. Mid-ocean, you only need to hold a corridor tens of miles wide. Near land, you concentrate the same skills to tighten the estimate. You shorten sail to reduce leeway. You time dawn birds. You steer a deliberate landfall triangle, approaching slightly upwind so that, if you miss, you can bear away along the island's line instead of being pushed past it. It looks methodical because it is. The sky work you did with Hokulea all night becomes a controlled daylight search pattern, shaped by wind and current, where you arrange to let the island discover you. You show up where its birds and clouds already are. Back to Hokulea. You add one more layer, season. The sky is not the same book each night, it is a rolling library. Your rising lists change month by month. The houses are constant, but which stars occupy them at a given hour shifts. This is why you learn multiple frontline stars for the same bearings, so that when Hokulea sinks earlier in the night in one season, another bright body can take its duty. In teaching, you sometimes stage simple experiments. Put two crews on deck at different times of year and ask them to plot the same course using different lead stars. The lesson is not that one star is better, it is that the system is resilient. Students often ask whether modern voyages prove the old ones. You answer carefully. What Hokulea and her sister canoes have proven in recent decades is that purposeful, non-instrument crossings are not only possible, but repeatable when crews are trained and disciplined. That practical demonstration countered 20th century arguments that Pacific settlement was accidental drift. It also did something socially important. It turned voyaging into a public school, a place where young people could apprentice to elders, where language returned to daily use, and where the plain skills of observation earned pride rather than condescension. The canoe is a laboratory, yes, but it is also a classroom and a ceremony of continuity. There is a temptation to frame this as rediscovery against European doubt, but you resist oversimplification. Pacific peoples carried and adapted navigational knowledge across many archipelagos for centuries. The 1970s revival did not invent attention to the night. It reinstitutionalized it, rebuilt boats, put teachers back on water, and gave communities public voyages to gather around. In that sense, speaking. Hokulea's name on deck is also speaking the names of teachers, Maupielog among them, who protected the thread of practice through lean decades, and then shared it widely when the chance appeared. The next deepening is teaching method. You do not teach stars by pointing at them and saying, "Remember." You build mnemonics from the canoe itself. The beam's height becomes a unit for star altitude. The distance from mast to stern makes an arc in your mind that you associate with a particular star's climb. You tie rising sequences to chants whose rhythm carries the order of houses. You couple sky with body. A star that should pass a palm's width off the stern quarter is easier to recall at 3 a.m. than 20 degrees. Many apprentices discover to their surprise that after a month of this, their perception of the dome has changed. It's no longer a sprinkle of points, but a moving grid with named joints. That is the quiet victory of wayfinding pedagogy. Because you are speaking to a listener trying to sleep, you pause to count the ordinary sounds that accompany this learning. The tap of lashings against a deck plank as the canoe breathes, the soft scrape of a bailer, the low voices of a watch change, a kettle lid settling. Between these you sink breath to the long heave of the ocean and, almost without force, you find the rhythm of correction. 1 degree here, 2 there, barely anything to look at but cumulative. Hokulea crosses the high sky at the expected time and your hands barely move on the steering sweep. This lack of drama is the point. The Pacific is too large for heroics every hour. It rewards steadiness. Finally you fold Hokulea back into arrival practice. On a typical approach you will try to reach the latitude of the target island or chain first, held with the help of your zenith and companion stars, then run downwind or upwind along that band until additional signs, birds, clouds, swell, complete the picture. This sail to latitude, then run longitude method is not written in those terms aboard the canoe, but it is what your routine achieves. Hokulea's job, shared with other bright guides, is to keep that first half tight so the second half is efficient. The result is that a voyage which sounds mysterious on land becomes a series of plain tasks at sea, each checked by phenomena anyone can witness. You end this section the way a watch ends, with a simple recap and a question. The recap is that a name, Hokulea, sits inside a system of houses, lists, swells, birds and clouds. That a canoe is a school where drills turn stars into bearings, and that the revival of these skills has been a community project as much as a technical one. The question is about the last mile. If stars and swells can carry you to an island's latitude, which precise low glamour procedures finally bring you through the reef pass and into anchorage without instruments, what does that choreography of arrival look and feel like from the steering sweep to the shoreline? You have held the latitude through a long, undramatic night. Hokulea rose where it should, travelled high and set neatly, its arc stitched into your memory by drills you could perform half asleep. Now the problem narrows. The question that closed your last watch returns. How do you turn sky and swell into arrival? The plain choreography that carries a canoe from the empty sea to a pass-through reef and finally to still water. The answer is a string of ordinary actions, none of them heroic, each of them meant to protect the quiet you have worked so hard to keep. You begin before dawn. You are careful about this because dawn is a hinge. Stars fade, but land signs strengthen. You give the helmsman a recap in a low voice, bearing held by swell through the dark hours, wind steady in its known name, no large cross sea. Then you pass along the likely directions for bird paths after first light. Frigate birds, terns and noddies are your commuters. Their morning lines are invisible until they aren't, and when they appear they will collapse your uncertainty faster than any single star. You remind the watch to notice not just the birds but their behaviour. Frigates circling high are scouts. Terns streaking purposefully are commuters returning to roosts or hurrying out to feeding grounds. Either way, their geometry hints at land. Before the sky goes fully pale, you steal a last look at the dome. Even washed in twilight, there are still stars to confirm what your bones already know. If Hokupa Polaris is visible low and steady to the north, you note its place. One last check against drift. Hokulea itself is down now, but the habit it trained in you, name, position, cross-check, does not vanish with it. Where stars were your first layer, the sea becomes your second. You step your attention down to the long swell and make sure it still agrees with your plan. If the swell feels off by a few points, you decide now, not later, whether to alter course a little upwind to give yourself an approach that won't push you past any reef pass. Light fills in. You breathe in and wait for smell, a faint damp sweetness that can ride out from land at dawn. It is not mystical. It is organic life and warm soil announcing themselves with a signature you recognise after enough voyages. At the same time, you study cloud bases. The underside of a small cumulus, brighter than its neighbours, may reflect a shallow lagoon. A line of puffed clouds, ragged but aligned, may mark an island's wind shadow, a cloud street writing a pointer downwind. You do not declare arrival on cloud alone, but when cloud and birds and swell all agree, confidence strengthens. Crew rolls are already in motion. You ask for a modest reduction in sail, not to slow for caution's sake alone, but to give the helmsman finer control and to keep the canoe from overshooting any narrow opportunity. Aced, crew member quietly moves the bailer to a handier place. Another lashes loose items because a last-minute turn in a tight pass is no time to chase a pot lid across deck. You make a point of this domestic discipline because it is navigation's unseen partner. When every object has a home, your mind is free to read the sea. The first birds appear, and your body tightens not with tension, but with focus. A turn angles across your bow at mid-height, then another at the same height, then a small string low along the water. You mark their directions. If two flows intersect, you imagine the triangle that forms where their lines would meet. That is where roosts or sandbars may be. The helmsman makes no big move yet. You're still assembling a case. Now the sea begins to change, very slightly at first. Long swell rhythms interfere in a way you've learned to call refracted. Somewhere ahead, a barrier is bending energy. You feel it less in your feet than in your hips, a slow twisting that asks for small helm inputs to keep your bow honest. You do not fight it, you register what it says about underwater shape. With sun fully up, watercolour becomes one more instrument. Ocean blue deepens until, over the shelf, it lifts toward green. On the far edge of that green, if the island is low, you sometimes see darker combs, the first hint of surf over reef. If the island is high, you may have seen its shoulder long ago, but high islands do not erase the need for precision. A volcanic wall can hide passes just as easily as a low atoll can. When the landmass clarifies, you resist the urge to drive straight in. You shift to a planned landfall triangle. If the wind allows, you approach slightly upwind of where you think a pass lies. This buys you safety. If you miss the opening, you can bear away along the reef's outside without being pushed past it. If you approached from downwind, missing the pass would leave you pinned and scrambling. To set the triangle, you choose two legs, one that takes you to a point abreast of the suspected pass, and a second that runs along the reef line itself at a respectful distance, watching for the signature of an entrance. While the canoe hums along this first leg, another team readies safety gear and quiets lines. A long sweep oar for emergency steering is unlashed. A heaving line is coiled ready. Someone checks the anchor and its rode, not because you plan to stop outside. Reef landings are no place for anchors, but because readiness is its own calm. You ask for a light snack and the hot drink you have trained your body to associate with patience. No one crowds the bow. 2 sharp eyes are enough. Excess bodies up front make the canoe wallow and hide low hazards from sight. You close the second leg and begin to run parallel to the reef. The helmsman keeps a steady offing, close enough to read water, far enough to answer a surprise set of seas without panic. You dictate 3 simple cues that together define a pass. 1. A break. In the line of white water where waves no longer detonate because energy can escape through an opening. 2. A river of darker, smoother water ruffling outward, the outflow from the lagoon ebbing through the gap. And 3. A change in sound, the hiss and thump of breakers softening into a lower, throatier draw. You add an optional 4th, sometimes a pair of range marks, natural or human, line up when you're on the safe axis. You do not count on that gift. You note it when it appears. The first maybe appears. A lull in breakers, but the water in the gap looks confused, not river-like. The outflow is not organised. You pass it. The second maybe is better. The line of surf is interrupted in a longer stretch, and you can see water streaming seaward in a coherent tongue, flanked by white shoulders. A pair of coconut palms inland line up neatly when you position yourself abeam. When you move on a few lengths, the palms split. You log the alignment. If you come back on the opposite tack, those trees may become crude range marks, telling you whether you have drifted off the axis. You do not turn in yet. You complete your triangle's second leg and then set for a third leg that reapproaches slightly upwind of the opening. This makes the final turn smoother. You talk through the plan so every hand knows the sequence. Turn at this point. Ease sail to reduce speed, keep steerage way. Hold the axis that carries you between the white shoulders where the outflow runs. You assign calls, 1 person for depth, colour at the bow, 1 for breakers to starboard, 1 for breakers to port. Helmsman repeating back the axis. The point of these calls is not drama, it is shared awareness. A canoe hears better when many eyes look calmly at different parts of the same sentence. The approach turn is a study in small motions. The canoe answers the sweep. The bow swings into the lane of darker water. You feel the ebb under the hull, a gentle helping hand out to sea that can become a shove if mishandled. You adjust sail again to keep just enough speed to steer, no more. The bow watcher's voice stays steady. Deep, 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 shoal, deeper, centre good. The helmsman holds the imaginary line between the white shoulders. If wind gusts or a set of waves tries to yaw you, the emergency oar is there to help push the stern back into line. You do not shout. Shouting is for poor preparation. For a moment the pass tightens. On either side, reef teeth show clear, and white water scrubs over them with impatient sounds. The canoe hums as flow accelerates beneath it. This is the place where landfall stories love to pause for flourish, but your practice doesn't. Your practice asks for breathing and small corrections. The outflow eases, lagoon colour brightens, fish flash. You're through. Inside, everything softens. Wind drops a shade in the lee of land, the short chop disappears, and smell thickens. You bear away to safer, known depths. Now, a different skill, set, equally plain, takes over. Someone goes forward with a sounding pole or lead line to confirm what colour and experience already told you. The helmsman looks for water texture that hints at coral heads, a dapple in the calm surface. You steer to give such heads a berth, remembering that coral is not just rock, but living architecture you owe respect. If you have a traditional anchoring plan, you pick sand where gear will bite without harming reef. An anchor is lowered, not thrown, rode is paid out evenly, the canoe settles. Arrival is not the end of navigation, it is the beginning of recording. You sit with the helmsman and the bow lookouts, and you review the sequence while it is still fresh. Which birds first, which smell, which cloud, what the swell felt like, where the outflow lay in relation to that pair of palms. You fold those notes into your mental log, and, if the voyage is a training sail, you might quietly put a few lines on paper so the next crew has prompts. The writing is sparse, the learning happened at sea, then come protocols. On some voyages, arrival is marked not with fanfare but with simple acts of respect. A greeting to the land and its guardians, a gift of words or water, a promise kept to the teachers who passed this skill down. The canoe itself is tended, lines checked, lashings retightened, small chafe marks addressed before they become failures. Food appears, not as celebration yet, but as recovery for bodies that stood steady through long watches. From the outside, these look like chores. From inside, they are the glue that binds a community to its tools, its teachers, and its places. You make time, too, for teaching the arrival while it is fresh. Apprentices trace the plan in the air with their hands, the triangle approach, the parallel run, the 3 cues of the pass, the axis between white shoulders, the reduction in sail, the calm voice of the bow lookout. You ask someone to talk through what they felt under their feet when the outflow caught the hull. Feeling is harder to teach than seeing, but a student's words can carry the sense forward, and the next time they will notice sooner. This is the quiet engine of tradition. Repeated, verifiable talk tied to lived sensation. If the island is a planned stop in a chain, the work of departure begins almost at once in your head. Arrival is a confirmation that your method works. Departure is a fresh test. You review the rising lists appropriate to this latitude for tonight. The winds that might require you to hold a new line, the swells likely to persist. Hokulea will play a different role depending on the season and hour, but the habit it taught does not change. Speak the name, assign the house, cross-check with other bodies, feel the sea. You use the quiet time at anchor to reflect on why the name matters. A star becomes more than a point of light when a culture ties it to survival, schedule and story. Hokulea is remembered in Hawaii not only because it is bright and high, but because generations made it practical. When a canoe in our time bore the same name and crossed the ocean by attention and care, the name's claim strengthened. You emphasize to your listener that this is not nostalgia, it is continuity. Tools of observation do not lose value because other tools exist. They grow in value because they are layered. A sextant, a chart, a GPS, these are excellent in their context. A trained body and a memorized sky are excellent in any context, particularly when you wish to carry knowledge in a way no failure of batteries can erase. You also address the modern impulse to rank methods. The point is not to prove that one way is superior to all others. The point is to recognize that practice shapes perception. After months of wayfinding, you no longer see a random sky. You see a lattice of relationships. That lattice changes how you steer and how you think. It encourages patience, rewards modest corrections, and builds trust in observation shared among a crew. These are not small outcomes. They are character, personal and communal, formed by the plain act of watching together. If you were to freeze the story here, with the canoe resting behind the reef and the day warming on deck, you could call it done. But this series is about the boring details that shaped history, so you keep going into the routines that keep knowledge alive after arrival. Nets are mended, a bailer is scrubbed, a minor crack in a deck plank is wedged and bound with fibre before it grows. The names of the night, Hokulea among them, are recited again at dusk for no other reason than that memory thrives on regular watering. You inventory food stores the way your ancestors did when stars doubled as calendars. How many days of taro remain? How many gourds of water? What foraging or trading will replenish the kit? You do these things without drama because generations learned that drama is inefficient. At some point, a visitor or a young crew member will ask the question beneath all the others: how certain can a person be, using only body and mind, that they will find a thin pass in a far reef? You answer without ornament. Certainty is a product of layers. Stars to maintain latitude, swells to hold course when sky is lost, birds and clouds to point toward land, a deliberate approach geometry to manage risk at the reef, clear language at the bow, modest speed, and readiness to turn away and try again if anything feels wrong. None of these layers needs to be perfect. Together they are strong. The only magic is discipline. By afternoon, you allow yourself a small human luxury. You lie back on the warm deck and look straight up. Hokulea is not there. Daylight hides it. But when night returns, it will climb again in its season, doing the same quiet work for someone else, on some other watch, perhaps on this same canoe, perhaps on another. You think about how many lives are braided into that thought. Teachers who spoke thee, names to you, builders who lashed the hulls you stand on, cooks who kept you steady with food, families who accepted absence so that practice could survive. A star is a star. The community around it is the instrument. For the sake of the series, you end with a reflection that looks forward. The act of naming a star, Hokulea, the star of gladness, and using it to hold a latitude is not just a navigational trick. It is a way of insisting that attention is a cultural resource. When attention is trained, shared and passed on, islands become neighbours, voyages become classrooms, and oceans shrink to the size of a circle you can hold in your head. In an age of instruments, this might sound quaint. In an age of failure, it sounds wise. There is dignity in knowing that if you were left with sky and sea alone, you could still choose a path, keep it, and arrive. Thought-provoking reflection. What other parts of daily life could change if we treated them the way navigators treat night? Dividing complexity into named houses, rehearsing small checks, and trusting shared observation over spectacle. And what would it mean, not just for canoes, but for communities, if we rebuilt more of our skills on attention that cannot run out of batteries? Before dawn, Matariki lifts, kitchens count taro, nets are mended, stars become tasks, and winter arranges itself quietly along village paths. You wake before dawn on a cold morning and step out where your breath lifts in a white thread. This is not a night for voyages, it is a morning for counting. Above the eastern horizon, low and a little to the left of where the sun will rise, a small spray of stars waits in the dark. You know this cluster by many descriptions. Tiny eyes, the eyes of a chief, but for you the simplest name is enough: Matariki. When it stands clear in the midwinter sky for the first time, its heliacal rising just before dawn, after weeks of being hidden in the sun's glare, it does more than mark a date. It opens a working season that runs on rules older than the garden fences and fishing racks around you. You stand still and let your own eyes adjust to the scale of the task. Your grandparents taught you to do this like you would check the water in a cooking pit, patiently and with attention to the small signs. Do you see many stars, crisp, or does the cluster blur, fewer points struggling through haze? On some mornings the air is clean and Matariki is sharp, the little basket of lights almost delicate. On others, wind and moisture smear it into a woolly tuft. These differences are not decorative, they are indicators. If Matariki is bright and well formed, you take it as a signal that the year ahead will be kind to food work and sea work. If it is dim or ragged, you temper plans. This is not fortune telling. It is a habit of caution in a place where a poor reading of season can empty storage pits by spring. You speak to the listener, you, the one reading in the quiet, because this series is about the boring details that keep community steady. So you say it plainly. Matariki is a calendar gate. When it rises, you turn the house of the year to a new room. You count those who have died since the last rising, because memory orders responsibility. You also count tools, digging sticks, fishing lines, net weights, the bundles of prepared flax. To outsiders, this might sound ceremonial. To you, ceremony is just where inventory and meaning shake hands. People remember what they repeat with care. The names inside the cluster help you organise work. You may have learned them as a child in a chant that pairs each star with a realm of food and weather. Tupuanuku links to things that grow in the ground, the kumara and the greens you will tend when the cold relents. Tupuarangi reaches to trees and birds, forest foods and the songs that ride the wind. Wait and Whiter twin the waters, one fresh, one salt, streams and lakes for eel and kura on the one hand, the open sea for fish on the other. Waipunarangi is the star you nod to when rain patterns matter for planting and gathering. Urarangi speaks for the winds you will name and work under. Pohutukawa turns you toward remembrance of the dead, because grief and gratitude shape how you share food. Hiwa-Itarangi makes space for hopes and plans, not as a wish machine but as a prompt to state priorities aloud. And Matariki itself, the body that holds the cluster's name, gathers these domains into a single practical checklist. You're not worshipping lights, you're sorting chores by the way the world usually behaves when those lights appear. You will also hear, as you move from region to region, that timing is local. The Maramataka, the lunar round you keep, threads through this star work. The night names of the moon form a rhythm of early and late planting, of fishing better and worse, of rest that saves strength. Wiro is the dark start, often a time for restraint. Tirea, Huna, and the growing nights build rhythm. Tamatea nights can be unsettled. Rakanui swells to fullness. Tangaroa nights often favour fishing. Mori and Mutuwenua tidy the end of the cycle. If you do not remember every name, you remember the feel of the sequence and what your elders did when each came around. Matariki's rising drops into this cycle like a peg onto a wheel. The year turns, and the wheel continues to tick under your feet. Because you're telling this for sleep, you slow down and walk through the morning routine without flourish. A fire is coaxed, not for spectacle, but for warmth and tea. Children are kept close. This is a morning to teach by showing, not by telling long lessons. An older person points with a chin or the curve of a hand. There is the cluster. They're the bright anchor of Riwa low down in season. They're the fraction of east where the sun will come. Talks are short. Eyes do the work. When the sky blanches, everyone shifts to the rest of the programme. If you're, community marks Matariki with an umu kohu wetu, a steaming earth oven made to feed the essence of the stars. You know the steps like you know how to fold a blanket. Stones are heated. Food associated with each star's domain is set aside in modest portions, something from the ground for Tupuanuku, a forest bird or berries for Tupuarangi, a morsel of eel for weight, a piece of fish for Waita, greens moistened for Waipunarangi, something wind-dried to nod to Urarangi, a silent space for Pohutukawa where names will be spoken, and a small, careful sweetness for Hiwa-Itarangi. The oven is covered, steam rises, words are said briefly and distinctly. This is not a spectacle for visitors. It is a memory practice for those who will carry the work forward. When the oven is opened, you taste a little, share the rest, and get on with the day. And the day is practical. Winter is not idle. It is preparation. You walk to the gardens when frost lifts enough to make a path that won't bruise the living. You kneel and crumble soil in your palm to feel its cold and structure. You lift the edges of Kumara storage pits, the Rua Kumara, to check for damp and mice, because stored food is the spine of a winter household. Where pits need repair, you plan to reline them with dry materials, to adjust their vents, to shift loads so that air moves evenly. You look at the old ko, digging sticks, and the garden keet, baskets, and decide which can be repaired and which will return to the fire to warm the hands that will make their replacements. In a world with no hardware store, maintenance is the economy. Fishing prep is equally unromantic and therefore important. You unwind Torah lines and pass them through fingers to feel for chafe. You count poito, floats. and power shell lures, not because a list looks tidy on a wall, but because a missing lure next month will be a wasted dawn. Nets are inspected knot by knot. The weights, stone or baked clay, are checked where their lashings tie to the mesh. If a net mending needle is cracked, you make a new one now. Winter seas can be rough. Your aim is not to challenge them, but to be ready on the good days that slip between storms. You take the same care with flax. Harakeke is cut and laid in bundles, not hurried, the angle of the blade preserving the plant. Strips are scraped and dried. The smell of damp fibre fills the shed. Older hands show younger ones how to judge a strand for keep strength or line suppleness, when to stop scraping, how to let fingers read moisture. The work is repetitive by plan. Repetition teaches hands to set pressure without thinking, which is what you need when a real day's chore stack grows high. You keep stories close to the work because stories remember what lists forget. When you say Pohutukawa's name as you check the pits, you are not performing grief. You're reminding yourself that the hunger of the living carries the memory of the dead. When you say Hiwa Itarangi and someone speaks a wish softly, Morkamara slips rooted by late winter, a safe inshore fishery for the children. You're not making demands on the sky. You are declaring communal goals. Later, when you decide between spending a fair weather day on net repair or fence mending, those declared priorities will sit in your chest and steer you silently. Because the year is not just land, you walk to the shore and watch the water. Winter introduces you to wider shifts, the indignation of a southerly, the relief of a northerly break, the brief glass of an unexpected calm. You sketch these in a simple notebook of mind, winds, swells, and tides speaking together. You also slide Matariki's message into your tide work. If the cluster rose bright in dry air, you may weight your planning toward planting earlier when soil temperatures allow. If it rose dim through heavy moisture, and you have already seen Waipunarangi confirmed in generous rain, you pace yourself for a slower start and stronger attention to drainage. The stars did not tell you the future. They invited you to measure what is already in motion. You add to this a domestic circuit that would never make a heroic song and yet keeps a community from fraying. Roof lashings are retightened, doormats are beaten, cooking stones are sorted by size so that the next umu is easier to build. Kites, pakau, are checked and restrung for the first fine winter winds, because sending a kite up is not only play, it's a way to watch how a gust behaves above hill height and to keep children within the grammar of wind. You count firewood with the same seriousness that you counted stars, because cold is not a poem but a fact. Mid-morning a child will ask how you know today is the new year, when the sun's path looks the same as yesterday's. You answer without mystique. You say that Matariki disappeared into the sun's light weeks ago as the year turned to late autumn, and that while it was invisible you continued to do what needed doing: harvest, store, lash, mend. Then, just now, it came back into view before dawn ahead of the sun, its rising announcing that this is the hinge. The world has not changed in an instant. We change how we count. Counting matters because it arranges fair work and fair rest. You also say out loud what elders modelled. Timing is tribal. Some iwi will celebrate when they first see the cluster in clear dawn. Others will wait for a particular moon night, or for weather to settle, or for the full ceremony to be prepared. This diversity is not confusion, it is fit. Practices shaped to coastlines, winds and valleys. A person who varnishes these differences into one rule forgets that locality is a teacher. By midday the frost has melted and you turn to soil making. Compost piles are turned without haste. You add seaweed where it will not burn roots later, and you tuck it under to keep its gifts from going to the wind. You make a shallow trench to catch and calm runoff before the next rain. You note where straw mulch has thinned. You do not plant yet, but you ready the ground so that when the lunar nights favour it and the cold is less sharp, planting can be done without frantic gathering. Winter rewards people who front-load the boring steps. On the way back you stop by the weir where elders sit with weaving or carving, and you listen with your hands, not interrupting the rhythm of their work. Someone hums a tune that carries the names of the Matariki stars. Someone else tells how, in a hard year, they read the dimness of the cluster as a prompt to tighten sharing rules, to dry more fish when the chance came, to plant slightly later, to watch the Tangaroa nights for better tides, to ask the woodcutting crews to double their stacks before storms taught the lesson the hard way. These are not fairy tales. They are operating notes made portable by memory. You adjust one more ring of the calendar in the afternoon, tool-making days and rest days. It is easy to imagine that industrious communities work all the time, but elders taught you to respect rhythm, not grind. On certain lunar days, with wind wrong and sea unfriendly, you call rest or light work. These pauses are not indulgence, they're efficiency, a way to keep hands steady when the real push comes with spring. You hold this line even when a restless youth wants to prove something against the sea. You point to the stars and the moon names and say, "This is how we have kept people fed and undrowned." As the sun tips, you do a small round that would be invisible in a painting and decisive in a life. You walk the fence of the Kamara patch to check for gaps where animals could enter. You lift the lids of storage bins and smell for sourness that would mean damp. You pull a sample tuber and cut it, flesh clean or beginning to spot. If the latter, you plan a cull. Better to lose a few deliberately than a store by neglect. You check where drips fall from eaves and place a trough to catch clean water. You look upstream and note a small slide where rain bit the bank. You put it on the list for the next fair day. In a world where you cannot phone for deliveries, attention is insurance. At dusk you gather again, as you did at dawn, but the sky now is for teaching recognition. Children point not only to Matariki as it sinks, but to the other lights that bracket seasons. You do not insist on perfection, you insist on use. If a child can find the cluster and say 2 names of its stars and connect one to a chore, Tupua Nuku, the ground, Wita, the sea, the lesson is embedded. Tomorrow when they choose to help mend a net or carry compost, a star name will ride with the chore, and a year later the connection will be reflex. You close the day in the way of people who value the past, with a short tally and a small hope. The tally is of items done, pits checked, nets mended, flax scraped, wood stacked, and of items deferred by weather, with a plan to catch them on a later moon night that suits the task. The hope is spoken to Hiwa Itarangi in the plainest possible language. Let us be ready, let our hands remember, let rain be measured, let wind teach us without harm. You do not expect the star to act. You expect yourself to act differently because you said the hope aloud where others could hear and help. When you lie down, you notice that nothing spectacular happened, and yet the year has unmistakably turned. The cluster's return has rethreaded labour, meals, memory and forecast into a rope you can hold. That is the quiet strength of Matariki. Not a single festival fire, but a web of small decisions aligned to sky and season, repeated by people who prefer continuity over display. You slept last night under an old name. You will sleep tonight under the same name, but with new chores stacked neatly at the door of the next month. Unresolved thought: if a small spray of stars can open a whole year of measured chores, soil turned, nets mended, stories refreshed, what other patterns in the ordinary world could be treated as gates that quietly reorder our work without a shout or a drum? You return to the cold edge of morning with the same steady purpose as yesterday, not to witness a spectacle, but to continue a program. If Section 1 opened the gate of the year with Matariki's first appearance, Section 2 walks through the doorway and looks around with a practical eye. You hold to the same principle that keeps households fed. Small checks repeated often are stronger than grand plans done once, so you take up each strand, garden, sea, storehouse, tool, story, and pull it until it sits taut. Begin with the Maramataka, the lunar rhythm that underwrites your choices. You do not need to be a priest to keep a sensible moon ledger. You keep the names in your mouth because names make the pattern memorable. Wiro for the dark start, Tirea, Huna, and Okoro as a gentle climb. Tamatea nights, sometimes unsettled, where winds shift and people mind their steps. Rakaunui, the round fullness that brightens beaches and keeps children awake. Tangaroa Amua through Tangaroa Kyokyo, a run of fishing-favoured tides, Mori resting the water. Mutuwenua, the thin end of the cycle when you take stock. You have been taught the same thing in different words your whole life. Pair the right job with the right day. It is not magic. It is managing energy. Planting on a day that often turns wet and gusty, wastes seed and temper. Mending on a day that begs for lines in the water, wastes calm weather. The Maramataka keeps you from bargaining with luck. Having set the rhythm, you return to garden work with winter's restraint. You turn soil to air it, not to punish it. You test a handful, Does it clump and crackle with frost or fall in damp crumbs? If it clumps, you do not break its back. You lay a mat of seaweed and straw to shelter it. You lay out drainage with more care than anyone will praise. Shallow cuts that move water. Away from tuber beds, a small hump on the row's crown so water moves left and right instead of pooling on top. A furrow that carries excess into a soakage patch packed with rushes. You set stakes for vines, not because vines are ready now, but because when a still day arrives you want the habit of no delays. You sort seed tubers by size and health. The small, healthy ones you reserve for planting. The largest, which seem generous, you often eat first. It is the quiet arithmetic of households. Do not bury your wealth and starve. Do not eat your future and brag. You inspect the Rua Kumara, the storage pits, again. In winter you visit them like family. If the vent hole felt cold and wet yesterday, you widen it a thumb's width today and set a small hood over it to keep rain from driving straight in. You add a little dry bracken to the lining where a patch looked tired. You move the top layer of tubers to the side and bring up a few from deeper down. Rotation reduces rot. If a child is with you, you show them how to listen. The difference between the hollow sound of sound timber in a pit cover and the soft complaint of a board that has started to drink water. The rule here is older than anyone alive. When in doubt, dry it. On a calm midday you attend to tool edges. The ko-ai, digging stick, gets its tip reshaped over a small patient fire, then hardened. A koi-koi, the lighter, sharper cousin, gets a new straightening if some hurried person leaned on it wrong last month. The toki adds sits in your lap while you redraw the angle the way your elder traced it on your palm years ago. You do not chase a razor. You chase a useful bite that will not chip easy. You rub oil into lashings so winter wet cannot gnaw at them so quickly. These gestures look like fussy habit to an outsider. You know they are time machines. 5 minutes now to save a day when the rush of spring makes every hour dear. You fold flax into the schedule with equal care. Harakik leaves are taken at the right angle and height, never from the rito, the child in the centre, always from the outer leaves because harvest is a relationship. Strips are scraped with shells along the grain. You do not hurry drying. You keep the bundles out of harsh midday sun to prevent brittleness, then bring them back to the shade of eaves where wind can move through. You rub a little pounded leaf to soften a batch that will become line, and you leave firmer strips for baskets. A weaving session becomes a class without anyone calling it that. Fingers show fingers how much pressure is too much, how to fix a broken strand without restarting the whole wall of the keet. You're not only making containers, you're making a memory palace, a place where motions attach to stories and star names until one cannot be recalled without the other. When wind lines the harbour in white marks, you surrender the shore to weather and turn inland to repair. The fence around a Kumara plot gets a new peg. Where a post began to wobble, you set stone footings under a weak corner. You lift the threshold of a storehouse so winter water stops trying to invite itself inside. You cement these choices with the same language you used at Matariki. We do this now so that later is easier. You learn over years that a day that asks for mending always arrives. Refusing it is how rot learns your name. Between chores you keep short counsels instead of long speeches. You do not need to declare a festival to coordinate work. The auntie who tracks food counts updates the numbers. How many net mending needles remain? How many good baskets? How many gourds for carrying water without leaks? The uncle who knows wind names mentions what the last 3 days have taught him about the season's temper. A teenager, asked about the line of clouds that stood over the range all afternoon, says what they saw and then is told what the old people call that effect. These talks are not ceremony, though the tone is respectful. They are logbooks spoken where pages can't be lost. When weather softens, you walk the beach with your kit. Nets are unrolled and mended in a row, each hand tied into the rhythm so that knots look like they were made by one person. Where the mesh meets the puito floats. You check whether old lashings have cut into the flax and begun to saw through the line. If a weight stone has worked its cordage loose, you ream the hole smooth with a shell, tie new wary, plait and seat it firm. You hang a section in wind to see how it falls. You want an open mouth to the sea, not a sulking curtain that will twist. The day ends with the nets rehung, never piled. A pile is an invitation to rodents and rot. You give the reef the same thought you gave the garden. Winter inshore fishing is a conversation with tides. On moon nights, when the water breathes big, you choose spots that depend on flow to carry bait scent. On small breath nights, you pick shallows where stealth matters more than pull. If the Tangaroa nights coincide with a northerly that calms the bay, you mark your calendar with a quiet smile and shift heavy work off that day to honour the gift. You go out with one more caution than in summer. Cold takes a small mistake and makes it large. You set limits before leaving, where to turn back if wind rises, how heavy a net to set with how many hands, what to do if swell carries the floats toward teeth. None of this is dramatic, it is prudence in sequence. You do not separate food from story. As you lay fish on racks for drying, someone hums the chant that lays Matariki's names over the work. Children join without being told. Tupu Anuku is said as a basket of greens arrives. Waita as silver bodies are threaded to dry. Urirangi when a gust asks you to shift a rack. This is not piety. It is cueing memory. Years from now, a grown child will feel a winter wind on their cheek and, without thinking, reach to tighten a lashing on a drying pole because a star. Name carries a chore with it. You keep accounts not to hoard, but to steer sharing. After the first good dry, you count bundles and apportion them. Elders first, widowed households, families with many children, crews who took the worst weather to bring the catch home. You make gifts modest and regular rather than large and theatrical. The old people taught you that a thin stream never fails. A flood arrives and is gone. In this the star work and the storehouse agree. Repeat small kindnesses and they become structure. Midwinter also brings teaching errands, not grand expeditions, just walks that glue places to words. You walk a child to the wind gap where a hill saddle invites a funnel, and you make them stand in it until they can feel the way a gust behaves before it arrives. You show them the drip line of eaves and why a trough placed here and not there will save hours in a month. You take them to a bend in the stream where eddies nurse debris and you say, "This is where you gather sticks after rain, never in the main flow where your feet will ask you for a price." You point to a distant ridge and say the sun's place at solstice lies there. Not a poem, a range mark for a farmer. The next time they hear someone call Hiwa Itarangi a wish star, they will nod and think of drier seed pits, not toys. When the air clears, you use evening to reinforce recognition. The cluster is easy. You make the harder ask, context. What stands near Matariki at this time of year? Which bright star rises earlier and can serve as a pre-dawn alarm on mornings when cloud threatens? Where does the curve of the Milky Way lay its brush when the cluster is due? You make rising lists for winter the way navigators do for voyages, not to sail, but time chores. If the bright marker you use for your wake-up is late by a finger's width over the hills, you know cloud has thickened. You adjust breakfast and postpone any weather-fussy work. The sky becomes clock, compass and caution sign, and you do not need a romance to use it. In the workshop, winter is for spares. You do not like spares because they sit in corners and look like laziness to busy minds, but you have learned to love redundancy. Another bailer joins the canoe. A second steering paddle leans by the door. A backup net needle sits in the basket where fingers can find it in a hurry. You label nothing. You enforce a habit. Things return home. A tool that has a place is a tool that is there when cold makes people clumsy. You build patience with little games that are really drills. Someone calls a star name in a direction, you point. Someone names a moon night, you name a chore that fits it. Someone names a wind, and you answer with which beach is safe and which is foolish. No one wins, everyone remembers together. This is the opposite of spectacle, a community reciting itself under its breath so that, when matter arrives, the right words are already on the tongue. On a day with slate sky and smudged rain, you shift indoors to stories that carry operating instructions quietly. A grandparent speaks of a year when Matariki rose blurred, haze and moisture, and how they took it as a cue to pace planting, to dig more drains, to double smoke on fish to survive a damp spell that mildewed baskets. Another tells of a year when the cluster was acutely bright, and the winter that followed was crisp. They pushed early slips of Kumara and were repaid. No one calls it science, and no one calls it superstition. The term you have inherited is remembering. The stars do not cause the weather you endure, they announce the stage on which known patterns often play. If the announcement is uncertain, your behaviour becomes more conservative. This is the adult's version of hope. Make plans you can pay for. When the wind finally clears, you return to small outdoor rehearsals that are the habit of careful people. You walk the approach to the reef channel in daylight from shore, and trace the range between two trees that, when aligned, lay on the pass axis. You notice where the winter swell has moved a sand tongue and made a false smooth where teeth hide. You store the change against some future night when you will be glad you knew. You open the canoe lashings that chafe most and reseat them with a little twist, so the fibre does not wear one shoulder. You smear a light film of fat on a place where a lashing rubs a spar. You rub a baler's lip on a stone to make it mate clean to the hull curve. You're not preparing for adventure. You're preparing against boredom's tricks, the failure that hides in routine because routine invites laziness. At the storehouse, you do one more thing that no song will celebrate. You measure time by food, not by days. You decide how many bundles of dried fish make a week for this many mouths with 2 days of storms. You calculate how many baskets of tubers can be opened without inviting rot into their neighbours. You mark a thin charcoal line on a post and agree, as a household, that when the hanging rack sinks to that mark, you will share less and stretch soups until a favouring moon. You tell the children this in clear words so that later no one must feel shame where prudence was the rule. Evenings gather people, evenings also gather lists. You keep them in your head if you can. If your memory is heavy with other things, you press a stick into dirt or a charcoal loop onto a smooth board. Tomorrow, finish the fence lashing near the southwest corner, rotate the pits, set the spare floats. A modest hunt inland on the first, settle tamatea if wind agrees. You include a rest line, because rhythm holds better than grind. The list is not a whip. It is a promise to your future self that you will not make them work twice for what you could do once. Nights remain instructional. Under clear cold skies you show how Matariki shifts a little each dawn, how the cluster climbs higher and the sun rises earlier, how the window of first sight narrows, and how your early rising habit must shift with it. You teach alternate markers, a bright star lower down that wakes you when the cluster is too high, a wind sound in the cabbage trees that means the same thing, a bird call that begins a little earlier each week. These substitutions make your calendar resilient. If cloud steals one cue, another will do. Before section 2 closes, you return to why all this detail belongs in a series for sleep. It is because ordinary steadiness is what changed the past. The great voyages and battles may stud history, but families who paired chores to moon nights, who read a cluster's clarity as a nudge toward caution or confidence, who kept stores dry and ropes sound, were the ones whose children lived to remember anything at all. Matariki is not a fireworks show. It is a board of deadlines and gentle prompts, an annual chance to state priorities, tidy habits, and retie community to the simple disciplines that work whether or not anyone applauds. You have one last round before sleep, a soft check of tomorrow's plan. If wind holds, nets will be inspected for the final third. If rain comes, flax will be scraped under shelter, and the pit's vents will be checked again. If an elder wants the oven stones turned to sweeten them, that becomes the day's anchor task. In all cases, the star names stand nearby, not as ornaments, but as labels you stick to each job in your mind so you can find it again without thinking. The night has one more clear patch. You step outside and see the cluster sinking, small lights above a black ridgeline, and you nod. Not because you expect them to do anything for you, but because their reliability justifies your own. Unresolved thought. If a community can steer an entire winter by reading a handful of stars in a plain ledger of moon nights, what other seasons of a life, money, health, learning, could be managed with the same quiet pairing of name, rhythm, and small repeated checks? You wake to a third clear dawn with the feeling that a knot you tied weeks ago has finally snugged down. Section 1 open the gate of the year at Matariki's heliacal rising. Section 2 walk the cold corridors of routine, pits, nets, flax, fences, pairing chores to moon nights without fuss. Section 3 brings you to the plain resolution of the season, how those quiet checks turn into first plantings, first forays, first distributions, and how a community closes its winter ledger without fanfare and sets the spring page clean. Nothing here is dramatic. Everything here holds the roof on. Begin where most years begin, whether or not anyone announces it. Soil that is ready enough. You do not wait for perfection. You wait for the 3 signs you were taught. Drainage that carries off last night's light rain without puddling. A handful of earth that breaks into soft crumbs instead of clods. And a forecast of moon nights that favour planting with at least one still morning ahead. You lift the covers from your Rua Kumara and check again for damp. Habit, not anxiety. Then choose seed tubers with the same conservative arithmetic you used all winter. You do not plant your pride, you plant your future's breakfast. The beds are low mounds with gentle shoulders, their crowns slightly raised so water slides away rather than pooling. In the aisle between rows you set small trenches, the kind that look like nothing from a distance, that catch and slow runoff, so the topsoil you worked all winter doesn't walk to the stream at the first hard rain. The child carries the hoe, digging stick, and learns to sink it by body weight, not muscle. The holes are spaced as your elders spaced them, because spacing is memory written in the ground, the distance that balances root room against weed work and watering. You set a tuber in each, eyes pointed as tradition prescribes, then pull earth close and pat it firm with a palm, the way your grandmother's hand taught your own. You do not call this ceremony, you call it planting. Before the first hot drink, you walk the line and name aloud the things you cannot yet control, but will prepare for anyway. Wind that might scrape moisture off new leaves, slugs when a damp spell returns, a cold snap that will ask for extra cover. You fetch mulch, dry rush, straw, seaweed tempered by weather, and lay it thinly. Thick mulch can smother. You aim for moderation. You set a few guard sticks where children might wander and where dogs forget their manners. You mark the end of the row with a shell bright enough to catch your eye at dusk. You keep the day steady by pairing landwork with sea readiness. If wind sits fair on a Tangaroa run and the bay reads calm, a crew that finished their mending shifts from shed to shore. You have already chosen safe limits. How many hands per net? What wind shift will turn you back? Where along the outer flats you will not lay because winter sand has moved? The nets you hung yesterday come down like a single cloth. Floats and weights are counted out loud as they go into baskets. There is no hero talk, only assignments. You're old-fashioned about this because your old people were right. Clarity prevents argument when tide and light grow thin. While the boats nose out, the garden team turns to the other food winter makes possible. Greens that shrug at cold, roots that laugh at frost under mulch, herbs that turn fat into flavour when dry stores grow dull. You do not chase novelty. You restore reliables. You tag 2 beds for experiments, a slightly earlier planting than usual, a different mulching pattern. Not because you love risk, but because households that never test forget how to learn. You write a mark on a stake rather than on your pride. If it fails, you will not bicker over memory. Midday is for the storehouse again because winter's end is when mistakes bloom. You lay out baskets and count what hangs, not to scold the past, but to instruct the distribution ahead. You mark what must be, eaten soon, things that will not keep into the next moon, and what can sit for a leaner week. You call 2 teenagers and teach the ledger you learned as a child. Elders and those whose hands cannot go to sea receive first, crews who have strained all week next, then families by mouth count, then the rest and neighbours who helped without being asked. You do not romanticize generosity, you ritualize it into a schedule so that kindness does not depend on somebody's mood. A messenger runs from shore, the first set is loaded, fish are on the way. The garden crew becomes a drying crew without changing tone. Poles go up on the windward side of the yard, lashings go taut, smoke pits are cleaned and fed. Children bring poha, kelp bags, a woven keet lined with leaves to carry the catch from shore to racks. The first baskets arrive. There is no cheering, there is sorting. Small fish for smoking whole, larger for fillets, offcuts for the broth that will feed the hard workers when chill creeps back into their hands. Someone sings the Matariki names without ceremony, the chant you worked into every chore all winter. Tupua Nuku with the greens on the bench, Waita with the silver bodies on the line, Waipunarangi with the kettles steam. The star list doesn't make fish dry faster, it keeps attention braided to work. By afternoon, the first slips of Kamara are in the ground, the first sheets of fish hang at the right tilt, and the nets are back on pegs with fewer holes than they left with. You walk the corners of the day like someone checking doors at night. Fence lashings, still tight. Pit vents, still breathing. Drying poles, no sway. You step into the ware and read the room. A repair to the second baler half done. A coil of line waiting for oil. A net needle nearly smooth enough to earn its place in the basket. You put a hand on each and assign a name to finish it. Tools do not complete themselves by inspiration, they complete by ownership. Toward evening, you keep the most old-fashioned appointment you know. The Umu Kohu Kohu Wetu, the steaming earth oven, repeated in small, not because the stars demand it, but because you do better after a pause. A modest oven goes down, stones heated, layers of greens and food placed, a small portion from each realm set aside as acknowledgement, not as tax. Names of the dead spoken under breath, names of the living who are far from home spoken just as softly. When the oven opens, steam carries the smell of work back through the day. Everyone eats a little of everything and then returns to finish what light remains. You close the daylight with teaching in place rather than lectures. A child stands where the garden meets the path and points to the shell that marks the row's end. You ask what will happen if the next rain comes heavy. They answer with your drainage trench. You walk to the racks and ask where wind will slice sharpest in an hour. A teenager points and shifts 2 poles without drama. You step to the canoe and pick up the new spare baler. The apprentice who carved it explains the curve they cut to mate to the hull. This is how knowledge moves, through hands that show and mouths that account for choices. Night comes easily when day has kept its shape. But before you let the listener sleep, you collect the resolutions you promised. The first is distribution, the schedule of who gets what and when, stated aloud so no one pretends confusion later. The second is rotation, which beds will rest, which nets will not go out twice in a row, which crews will swap duties so that no set of muscles bears all the cold. The third is record, a handful of charcoal strokes where you keep them, on a post, a plank, a smooth stone, so that in a month when someone asks whether this winter was fatter or leaner than last, you can answer with marks, not mood. You give a last attention to risks, the way elders always did before bed. You name the 3 likely failures of early spring so they will not surprise you. A warm wet week that invites rot under mulch, a late southerly that stings the new leaves, a run of perch or dogfish that shreds nets faster than you can mend them. For each, you say the counter move now while everyone is warm. Lift mulch a little and move air. Be ready with woven covers and patient replanting. Mend in teams and shorten sets until the predator run passes. The speech is short. People retain short. Only after that do you let yourself look up. Matariki is higher now than at the first dawn, its season advancing, its daily window shrinking. You point it out once more, not as omen, but as clock. In a week it will climb too high to serve as your waking cue. You will shift to another bright marker and carry on. That, in a sentence, is the resolution of this story. Not a finale, but a handoff. From winter schedule to spring routine, from star to star, from chore to chore, each modest enough to finish, altogether strong enough to feed a village. Because this series honours the past, you close with how people have held this pattern in living memory. Some households follow a formally declared Matariki holiday now. Others keep to the older cadence of families and hapu setting their own dates by sky and weather. Some communities invite schools to the morning watch. Others retain the practised quiet of a small circle. Everywhere the core is the same because the core works. Count the year at the cluster, name your dead, state your hopes, tend your stores, match jobs to moon and weather, share with order, and keep small spares ready. No instrument argues with this. No century improves it out of usefulness. It is a way of paying attention that makes households durable. If you need a single sentence to carry away from 3 sections, take this. Matariki is the calendar's hinge where memory and maintenance meet. The hinge squeaks when neglected. It swings smooth when oiled by habit. You oil it with lists spoken aloud, with chores divided, by moon nights with star names attached to jobs so that children inherit not stories only but schedules. You offer one more practical image before sleep. Tomorrow, someone will step into the garden at dawn with a bowl of clean water and pour a palm's worth at the base of each new slip. Not because the sky will not rain, but because a measured beginning teaches hands and plants the same thing. We will do a little, again and again, and it will add up. On the beach, someone else will coil a heaving line twice instead of once, then lay it where a cold hand can find it without a search, because the movements that looked like fussy habit in winter are the movements that save a minute when the tide turns. In the storehouse, someone will slide a basket 2 hand widths to the left so wind can pass through. That hand width will buy back a week in spring. These are resolutions made of actions, not speeches. And the listener, you, turns out the lamp with the oldest comfort people know. The year has a shape again. A small cluster rose. Work took its cues. Food moved where it needed to go. tools nested where they belong, hopes were said aloud with no boasting. The dead were named without drama, and beds were put to sleep that will wake green. No music swelled, no trumpets called. The world turned on hinges that grandparents would recognise. Thought-provoking reflection. If a handful of star names and moon nights can still align a community's planting, fishing, sharing and remembering, what might happen to the rest of our crowded lives if we treated them the same way, naming the few points that matter, practising modest checks, and letting quiet repetition carry us towards sufficiency rather than spectacle? On an open beach, Hokupa refuses to wander. Canoes are pointed by a fingertip. North settles in the ribs, steady as breath. You step onto the night deck with a task so modest it hardly seems worth a story. Point to north and keep it in mind while other cues come and go. In higher latitudes this would be simple work. Hokupa, Polaris, sits well above the horizon there, a small patient light hardly moving at all. You are working near the edge of the tropics, where heat still lingers in the wood after sunset, and the wind comes in even breaths. Here, Hokupa does not ride high. It hugs the horizon, low enough that a small cloud, a bank of haze, or the glow of a distant storm can swallow it whole. Finding north, in other words, is not a moment, it is a habit. Begin with what your teachers drilled without poetry. Hokupa sits close to the north celestial pole, and its height above your horizon roughly equals your latitude. At the Tropic of Cancer, that height is about a handspan and a half, roughly 23 degrees, no more than a few fists stacked on one another at arm's length. In Hawaii it rides a little lower, nearer the equator, lower still, and on the equator itself, it hides on the line where sea and sky are one. The rule is so plain that it is easy to ignore how useful it becomes on a working night. If your mind knows how high Hokupa should sit from here, your eye can tell at a glance whether you are holding your latitude lane or drifting from it. You do not treat Hokupa as a charm, you treat it as a check. The star compass you carry in your head, the circle of houses named for the directions where stars rise and set, does the daily labour of steering. Hokulea, Arcturus, Macalium, Orion's Belt, Matariki, the Pleiades, Bright Antares, the line of Vega and Deneb. They all pass across the dome and give you bearings you can use for hours. Hokupa's gift is different. While the others move, it barely moves. When you glimpse it, low, steady, cautious, you do two things quietly. First, you confirm north and feel your shoulders loosen a notch. Second, you check whether it sits at the expected height. If it rides higher than you expect for this island's latitude, you have been leaning poleward. If it rides lower, you have been sliding equatorward. No numbers are needed. A finger width on the sky is enough to make you adjust the sweep of the steering oar by a finger width, and over a night of small corrections the canoe stays true. At this latitude the horizon is busy. Heat throws mirage waves across the seam of sea and sky. The eye wants to invent what it cannot hold. You learn not to grab at Hokupa the instant you think you see it. You calm your gaze, soften your focus, and look beside the point you are testing, letting the star declare itself by steadiness, rather than by your hunger for it. Apprentices are impatient and point too soon. The star you want blinks out when a ripple of haze runs along the horizon, and you are left holding the memory of a speck. The antidote is ritual. Glance, breathe, recheck, confirm with neighbours, the faint arc of the Little Dipper if the night is kind, or the position of Koshab and Firkad, the old guardians in Ursa Minor, if the air is clean. You do not turn a canoe on the strength of a single flicker. Because Hokupa is low, you find north many ways, and you teach all of them so that none is a surprise when the others vanish. If Hokupa is lost behind a squall line but the sky above is open, the east-west trail of familiar stars keeps your course until the horizon clears. If the sky's a curtain and you must steer by sea alone, the long swell, the background pulse from a far storm, takes command. If both sky and sea are hard to read, you shorten sail, reduce speed, and save your position until a reliable cue returns. This is not timidity, it is craft. North is not a place to aim at blindly. It is a relationship between body, hull, wind, and sky that you maintain by refusing panic. You also respect limits that geography sets. South of the equator, Hokupa does not rise at all. In Tahiti, in the Cook Islands, in Aotearoa, North is not a star, but a construction you build from other lights and from south-facing anchors like the Southern Cross, Tupunga the anchor, whose long axis points toward the south celestial pole. Knowledge travels with voyagers. You know both hemispheres' habits, even if tonight's work is northern. The point is not to impose a single tool everywhere. The point is to fit tools to the water under your hull. Near the edge of the tropics, Hokupa's presence is a comfort but also a discipline. You rehearse its height ashore with nothing more than your arm. You stand on level ground and raise your fist at arm's length, counting fist widths from the horizon to the small patch of sky where north should sit. You place a stick in the sand and sight along it, then sight along the stick at sea and learn how much deck motion you can tolerate before your eye lies to you. On the canoe you use parts of the boat as memory. 2 fist widths above the crossbeam when I'm standing here, half a hand below the lashings when the deck is loaded this way. These are not instruments in the European sense. They are personal gauges, repeatable enough that a small change rings like a quiet bell. You also prepare for the nights when glow muddles the horizon, moonlight, sheet lightning beyond the world's lid, the dull haze that sometimes fills the band between sea and sky. On such nights you do not stand frozen waiting for a perfect north. You triangulate, a faint hint of Hokupa at the right height, the eastward set of a known bright pair, the sea's long pulse agreeing from the quarter you expect. Any two together justify confidence, any disagreement invites caution. A young helmsman once asked you how many signs are enough. You said 2 to choose, 3 to trust, and made them repeat it until they were sick of the phrase and would remember it anyway. Because a star near the pole moves slowly, apprentices attempted to think it is truly fixed. You do them a kindness and ruin the illusion. You point out how Hokupa makes a tiny circle around the pole through the night, how in the time it takes to boil water, it will have shifted just enough to mark the world's spin, how, over many human lifetimes, the pole itself slides by the slow motion of the sky, you do not name, procession to them unless they ask. The fact is enough, the term can wait. The lesson is humility. No light is perfectly still. What makes Hokupa useful is not mythic immobility, but predictable smallness of motion. Small enough to use, large enough to test your attention. You keep domestic matters close to navigation. A person who hunts low stars needs a deck with clutter controlled. You lash bailers where they will not roll and steal your eye. You insist that a coiled line be a coiled line, not an animal sleeping in a corner, because the moment you glance down to tidy a mess is the moment a clear sight on Hokupa will pass behind a smear of cloud and cost you a correction. You ask the watch to speak in quiet, short words, not because you are sacred, but because hearing breakers or a change in wind 2 beats earlier keeps you from jamming the helm at the last second and losing the delicate line you've been holding against the horizon. You fold daytime north finding into the story because a canoe does not sleep when the sky is blue. In daylight, north is a wind and swell inferred direction. You check against the sun's path. At local noon, the sun sits to your south in these latitudes. Its shadow tells you a line that, when corrected for the season and for your sail plan, pairs with what your body already knows. You teach apprentices to sketch the sun's arc with their hands, to mark where it rose and where it will set, and to carry that line in their chest so that when clouds draw a roof over the world, they can still point without argument. This is not bravado. It is maintenance of orientation, like keeping a clean galley or a tidy lashing. The mind too needs a place for everything and everything in its place. The star compass makes north more than a point. It turns the horizon into a named ring. On the northern side of that ring, the houses that bracket Hokupa become quiet sectors you get to know, by smell and breath as much as by sight. You can stand on deck and say to yourself, north-northeast, the swell should arrive like this on my port shin. North by east, it will tickle the hull there. True north, the helm will feel light and a little nervous because any small slip shows at once. You're not waiting for a miracle to tell you where to aim. You are wearing the compass the way a craftsman wears a habit. You also teach what to do when north is wrong. A nervous crew tries to force the canoe toward an imagined line. You teach the opposite. You relax speed, open your options, and let the next clean sign arrive. On a night with a dirty horizon, you might hold a safe bearing by a western or eastern star you trust, and wait for Hokupa to reappear to confirm. On a night with dirty sky but honest sea, you might hand the shift to the swell and let Hokupa go. On ugly nights you shorten sail, stand off and conserve attention. You repeat a tired proverb, "We do not hurry to the reef," and you enforce it without apology. Because this series honours boring history, you include the rehearsals that make calm possible. On land at dusk, you put the crew in a circle and call out north houses in random order. They point with their whole bodies, not just hands, feet set as if on deck, knees soft. You have them raise a fist and count fist heights to simulate Hokupa's altitude at different islands in your sailing world. You make them do it slowly, then quickly, then in the presence of a colleague speaking nonsense to them, because distraction is the enemy at sea. If someone laughs off the drill, you send them to fetch water until they stop laughing. The ocean gifts no extra time for pride. You fold in the lived limits of the eye. Near the horizon, extinction, the way the atmosphere dims light, eats fainter stars first. Hokupa is not brilliant. It can be lost on humid nights. You teach a trick that is older than charts, averted vision. You look a little to the side of where Hokupa should be. The more sensitive parts of your retina gift you a light your focused gaze cannot hold. You do not promise miracles. You promise a slightly better chance of reading the world you already live in. On some nights, a swell from the north runs exactly with your course. The canoe wants to yaw. A helmsman who thinks north is a command fights, tires, and begins to drift. A helmsman who thinks north is a conversation trims the sweep, changes the sail's belly, and lets the boat and sea compromise. Polaris does not demand straight lines. It allows true outcomes, safe arrival at the latitude and land you intend, achieved by curves that respect the living water under you. You stretch the frame beyond one island. The edge of the tropics is not a razor, but a band where many voyaging routes cross. The value of Hokupa changes with the leg. Sailing east or west, you love stars that ride those bearings for hours. Sailing north or south, Hokupa's height and the Southern Cross's southern reach, if you are far enough south to see it, become instruments you use without numbers. You do not insult either hemisphere by arriving with the wrong tools. You carry both sets in your mouth because teachers did. Before you close, you step into the quiet chores that make north easier to keep. You reeve lashings where they won't squeal and pull your attention away from a low horizon. You oil a creaking sweep collar, so a correction can be made without noise that drowns the sound of a distant breaker. You set a watch order that brings a fresh pair of eyes just before the hour when the haze usually fattens. You clip a telltale of light fibre to the shroud where the watch can read small wind shifts without looking up. None of this is clever. All of it creates the conditions under which a low, shy star can serve as a faithful co-worker. And then there is the teaching story you hand down without drama. A memory of a night when an apprentice, hungry to prove themselves, steered by a phantom, a fairy glow masquerading as a star, and dragged the canoe a dozen miles off its lane before the watch caught it at dawn. The correction was not an argument. It was breakfast, a short lesson about sources and patience, and a return to drill at the next harbour. Pride receded, practice resumed. The canoe arrived when it needed to. This, more than any single technique, is the traditional outlook at sea. We keep what works by repeating it. We discard what flatters us when it fails. You end this first section the way you began, with a small act. You lift your hand and measure the height of Hokupa, 2 fists and a little at this latitude, and you name the north houses out loud where you stand, a ring of syllables around a ring of sea. You do it not to charm the ocean, but to calibrate yourself. A person who can point north from the edge of the tropics, in the dark without impatience, is a person whose other choices will likely be orderly. Hokupa's slowness has taught you something rare, that steadiness is not the absence of movement, but movement small enough to use. You fall in love not with a star, but with the discipline that lets a community arrive. Unresolved thought. If a barely moving light near the horizon can keep a canoe honest for whole nights, what other low, easily ignored signs in our lives, quiet routines, soft warnings, humble checks, might be our Hokupa if we trained ourselves to look for them before the haze swallows them? You pick up where the night left you, not with a revelation, but with a routine. If Section 1 taught you to treat Hokupa as a check, never a charm, Section 2 makes that check durable. North at the edge of the tropics is a thread you retwist every hour. A little from the sky, a little from the sea, a little from the boat itself. Nothing in this is dramatic, which is why it works. Begin with the height habit. Your elders never stood you on a wharf and recited degrees. They stood you on level ground, stretched your arm and taught the body ruler. A fist at arm's length spans roughly 10 degrees, a 3-finger pinches about 5, a single finger 2 to 3. Near these latitudes, Hokupe'a sits only a couple of fists above the horizon, low enough to lose behind a ripple of haze, high enough to measure if your feet are quiet. You learn to pair that height with objects on your canoe so the gauge travels with you. An index finger below the lashings when I stand by the after beam, a fist and a half above the fore crossbar when the hold is full. The numbers never reached your mouth, repeatable sight lines did. Then came the neighbours. Hokupe'a is modest. Some nights it needs an introduction. Your teachers made you memorise the faint scoop of Ursa Minor, so that on rare clear nights you could confirm north by pattern, not hope. On other nights, you learned the role of the brighter guardians, not to worship names, but to carry cross-checks in your head. If Hokupe'a is shy behind haze, a familiar east-west runner, the line of Orion's belt in season, or a bright pair like Vega and Altair later in the year, crosses the houses at known bearings and gives you time to wait for a better look. You're not hunting a single light, you are reading a grid. Nothing keeps a grid honest like drill. You did not begin on water, you began on sand with a circle scratched by heel, the horizon divided into houses with names your tongue could keep when your eyes were tired. Someone called north by east, and you pointed your whole body, not your hand. Someone called north-northeast, and you stepped your right foot forward until both knees made the angle your steering sweep would ask for at sea. Suddenly the words stopped being a compass rose and became postures your body could remember under wind. Later, on deck, the same calls returned with the boat's hum under your feet. By then, the ring lived in your knees. The edge of the tropics complicates line of sight. Heat breeds a band of trouble along the horizon. Moisture, dust, the low glow of sheet lightning beyond a far squall. You learned a trick as old as night, averted vision, to coax faint things from the soup. Don't stab your gaze where you think Hokupe'a is. Look a finger's width to the side and let the more sensitive parts of your eye pull the star into being. Do not grip the moment. Breathe. If it holds for 3 breaths, you have a witness. If it blinks out with the next faint ripple of haze, you do not argue with it. You go back to your runners and your swell and try again. North is a habit that forgives one miss and punishes persistence in error. Because you are working low, noise discipline is navigation. You remove squeaks from the sweep collar with oil. You lash bailers where they cannot roll and steal your eye. You keep the coiled lines in their places. Your watch speaks in short statements so that the small sounds you need, change in the bow's hiss, a far breaker, the short slap of a crosswave coming from the wrong quarter, still enter your ear. None of this looks nautical in a painting. All of it makes space for a shy star. You keep daylight north in your pocket, because a canoe cannot wait for dark to choose decency. Near these latitudes, the sun's noon sits to your south. The shortest shadow points roughly north. No one had you draw declination tables on bark. They had you lay a stick in the sand, mark the tip of its shadow through the morning, and inscribe a shallow arc. By noon, the shadow fell near the arc's middle. A simple line through the stick and that point, corrected by wind and swell and the lived knowledge of your course, gave you a usable north to carry until the sky returned. When clouds closed the day, you held wind names and swell feel together. With this wind and this long pulse on my left shin, my bow's memory of north is there, you said, and your hands agreed. The swell matters because nights fail. The long groundswell lines that run from far storms keep their aim through weather. You do not need a myth to use them. You stand with bare knees, feel the dominant heave in your thighs, the cross on your ribs, and you note how the canoe wriggles when you point a little too far to either side. If the night is blind, you steer as if your stern were tied to a rope stretched along the long swell's crest. When the sky opens again and gifts you Hokupe'a at the right height, you check the rope you built from water. If swell and star disagree by a finger, the star wins. If the swell has saved you for 3 hours with no sky, you thank it and narrow your course with the star back on duty. The sea and sky are colleagues, not rivals. Because this is a traditional outlook, you honour limits plainly. South of the equator, Hokupa never rises. It lives entirely in story. Close to the equator, it can sit on the seam of sea and sky and refuse to separate from haze. On those routes you do not mourn the missing tool. You switch to southern anchors, the long axis of the Southern Cross pointing toward a south you cannot see, the orientation of nearby pointer stars, the way certain southern runners cross your houses at appointed hours. You do not force a northern habit on southern water, you fit. More drill, because steadiness is repetition. One elder loved a game that apprentices hated and then loved, no sky watches. They shut your eyes with a cloth, spun you in place on deck and made you reorient by swell only. When they removed the cloth, they said, "Name your north." Then they sat in silence while you found Hokupa or some other honest witness and corrected what your knees had guessed. The point was humility. The sea is a good friend, but it bends where reefs and islands whisper under it. Only a fool marries one witness. In star work you cherish redundancy. Along your ring of houses you keep pairs and backups for every bearing, especially those you use to tether north. Bright runners that rise and set on either side of your lane, and a few seasonal alternates for nights when a favourite is late. You do not pretend the sky is a single map. The sky is a calendar that moves. Tonight's Hokupea height is the same. The parade of your east-west helpers is not. You teach an apprentice to stand at dusk and name the first 3 lights they plan to use through their watch. Just before dawn, they must say which 3 took over. It is not a trick. It is the handoff that makes watches knit. Low stars demand clean edges, so you watch the horizon itself like a tool that can break. After rain, haze can sit as a false shore that makes Hokupea look higher than it is. You learn to test with a low runner, a star whose path near the horizon is familiar. If that runner vanishes at a height it should withstand, you discount all heights by a finger. You tell your hands, "The world is hazier than my hope." This is not pessimism, it is calibration. Errors have a culture. The most common is the phantom, a ship's masthead light or a fishing fire pretending to be Hokupa, where Hokupa could never be. The antidote is not scolding, it is source discipline. You ask a watch to prove 3 things before they turn a canoe. Is the light steady in place? Does it sit near the right height for this latitude? Does it live where the neighbours say it should? Little Dipper faintly curving off it on a clean night, or at least no east-west runner contradicting it. If any answer is no or I don't know, you hold your course a little longer and seek a second witness. 2 to choose, 3 to trust. You keep humility in the story of the pole itself. You tell a simple truth without decoration. The point in the sky that the world spins under wanders slowly across centuries. Hokupa is close now. Long ago another star lived closer. Long from now another will. You do not mention terms unless asked. You stay with the lesson. Don't turn awe into blindness. Treat the helpful star with gratitude. Keep space in your mind for change. Because a canoe is a school, you make memory aids out of what you touch. The lashings that run forward from the mast, all aligned slightly off a true fore and aft, become rays you mark in your mind. When Hokupa sits over the 3rd lashing from port, the bow is honest. Over the 2nd, you are wandering. Past the 1st, you're making a new lane without admitting it. No one carved this into wood. The crew agreed on it, then enforced it by habit. If the lashings are retensioned, the agreement is repeated so memory and fibre match. Night after night you cultivate tempo. A nervous helmsman checks too often, sees little, and tires. A lazy helmsman checks too rarely, misses drift, and must snatch at the sweep to correct late. Your elders taught a watch rhythm: sky, sea, sail, silence. Look up, confirm house, light or dark. Look down, read long swell and short wave. Look sideways, belly of the sail. Is it honest to the wind you named at the start of watch? Then be quiet for a count and listen for breakers. The tiny change in hull tone that warns of set. The shift in crew breathing that hints at fatigue. Repeat. No one writes sky, sea, sail, silence on parchment. They write it in the body until the body owns it. There is also speed discipline. When Hokupa is low and the horizon lies, you shorten sail. Speed steals judgment. A small error at 8 knots becomes a stubborn mile before you finish arguing with yourself. At 5 knots, the same error corrects with 2 finger widths on the sweep and no story to tell. Young crews want to arrive, older crews want to have arrived with the canoe whole, the lashings without burns, and the taste of sleep unpoisoned by a near thing. The remedy is not caution as a posture, it is caution as procedure. Change one thing at a time, at a size your watch can read. You honour the domestic measures that let all of this happen again tomorrow. You put a pot of warm drink within reach on cold watches, because the best eyes in the world are useless when a body shivers and the horizon shakes. You assign a quiet singer, not a shouter, to keep a soft chant of houses and winds moving when clouds hold for an hour. You rotate the bow spotter so that the same neck does not lock and start lying to its owner. You make spares normal. A second bailer, a second net needle, a second heaving line laid where a cold hand will find it without looking. These are not luxuries. They are buffers against the small accidents that try to pull your gaze from a low star at the wrong moment. You also fold north into arrival. Choreography because watches do not end in the middle of oceans. When you close a reefed coast, your commitment to Hokupa changes shape. You still take it as a truth test, but you shift centre to signs of land, bird paths at dawn, the long V of cloud on a steady trades day, the subtle refracted swell that makes your hips correct without asking your head. Hokupa says your latitude corridor is sound. The reef says where inside that corridor you must pass. You run a landfall triangle slightly upwind of the suspected pass, then parallel the reef to read outflow and sound. You do not force the axis of an opening to match some idea in your skull. You obey the break in white water and the river of smooth that runs between its shoulders. North still matters, but safety outranks neatness. On shore, the teaching continues with boredom well used. At dusk in a canoe shed, a mentor points to the low north through an open door and says, "Measure it," and you lift your arm and count fist without looking like you care. Then they say, "Now measure it from the other door," and when the frame shifts, your body realizes that reference matters. The lesson is not to distrust your hand, it is to know what your hand is anchored to. Laughter often follows because everyone remembers the first time the same sky gave two answers because the floor under their feet had changed. Some crews keep little verses, nothing grand, just lines that stick to the mouth. One likes low star, slow hand, high seas, small plan. Another, 2 to choose, 3 to trust. A third, sky, sea, sail, silence. A verse is not a rule, it's a hook to hang prudence on when sleep is thin. With the years, these phrases carry the weight of faces. The elder who said them, the night they were proven, the bruise avoided by a crew that swallowed pride and reefed early. Because the series values what lasts, you say aloud what modern gear has not erased. A person who can construct north from sky, sea, and wind is a person who can endure battery failure, trick lights, and argument. Instruments are wonderful. Communities own them when they also own attention. Hokupa, low and patient, becomes a teacher of temperament. Check quietly, correct gently, prefer confirmation to certainty, and leave room for the sea to have a say. You close the watch without flourish. Hokupa sits where your fist taught you it should. A faint runner crosses the east houses at the hour you expected. The long swell, a friend all night, still presses your left shin at the same rhythm. You reduce sail a scrap to ease the boat and hand the sweep to fresh hands. You say the house names once in order, like grace. Someone answers with the wind's name in the swells. You go below with a back that feels the boat's breath, and a mind softened by the oldest luxury sailors know, boring correctness. Unresolved thought. If keeping north at the edge of the tropics depends on a dozen small agreements, body rulers, quiet decks, shared phrases, and the humility to wait for a second witness. What other decisions in our lives might become steadier if we replaced big declarations with the same web of small repeatable checks? You come to the last watch of this story, the way you came to the first, with a small task. Hold north long enough to hand your lane to arrival, then hand arrival to routine. Nothing fancy. The canoe has carried you through nights of lowlights and small checks. Dawn waits somewhere behind your left shoulder. Section 3 is not about discovering a new trick. It is about closing the circle, how a shy star near the horizon becomes part of the choreography that gets you safely through reef and into still water, and how the habit that made that possible is preserved for the next crew without speeches. Begin with the handoff from sky to sea. In the last hour before dawn, the horizon is its most confusing. The eye wants to believe a pale seam is true level. The air lays a silver band where sea should be. Distant sheet lightning, if there is weather beyond the world's lid, makes a fakely steady glow. You do not argue with the horizon's mood. You keep your watch rhythm, sky, sea, sail, silence, and accept that the sky portion may give you fewer clean reads than earlier in the night. Hokupa is there, then not, then there again. You check height when you can. When you cannot, you let the long swell keep the thread and you refuse to muscle the canoe toward an imagined line. North is a bearing, arrival is a place. Your duty is to be close enough to let place speak. Dawn does not blow a trumpet. It abides by the same ledger that has governed the voyage. Little entries that add up. A cooler breath crosses the deck. Dark becomes less black. The first bird voice comes thin and early from somewhere aloft. You tell the helmsman what you expect. Bird paths at first light, long cloud streets if trades hold, the small change in swell tone when land begins to bend the sea's energy. None of these is a command. Each is a candidate witness. The star that served you through the dark shifts to reference now. You keep its height in memory as a last check on latitude. Your eyes begin to hunt signs of land where the reef will require obedience. You make one quiet adjustment as grey widens. You shorten sail, not to creep, to sea. Lower speed gathers a detail you would otherwise miss. The faint river that runs seaward through a pass, the subtle texture change where coral lies shallow under calm water, the first intersection of bird flows over the eastern quadrant. You repeat the predictable words, 2 to choose, 3 to trust, and wait to be persuaded. Navigation has taught you that hurry makes liars of honest cues. The first birds appear, terns cutting hard and low from your starboard quarter, then a smaller flock angling across the bow. 2 flows that, drawn as threads, will likely converge over roosts or sand lips inside a lagoon. You pencil, the geometry in your head. Okupa is no longer the loudest voice. It hums beneath the conversation like a bass note, latitude still sound. You step to the rail and look straight down. In the slant light, the sea's skin begins to write legible words. Ridges and slicks that were only suggestion in the dark become lanes and eddies. A spare hand moves the bailer to its station. Another lashes a pot lid so it will not skate at the worst moment. The domestic and the directional remain one craft. A slow, subtle twist begins in your hips. This is the unglamorous sign you wanted. Long energy running in from outside has met a refraction field, a reef line curving the swell. The helm asks for small, frequent touches to keep the bow honest. You do not fight the twist, you read it. If it strengthens, you will expect a barrier ahead, even if eyes have not yet served you a line of white. You say as much aloud so that when you later speak the plan, landfall triangle, parallel run, axis, you're not introducing novelty but confirming what bodies already knew. Light grows, a rent of white water shows and vanishes, then shows again, not much, just a scribble. You resist the urge to declare a pass from 2 glimpses. You work the triangle instead. Set a course to finish a short leg slightly upwind of where you suspect an opening, then run parallel outside the reef, holding an even offing while eyes, ears and hull agree on what they read. This is where the long night's north discipline pays out its profit. Because your lane by latitude is tight, the reef you meet is the reef you meant to meet. You're not translating north errors into search miles under a warming sky. The signs accumulate the way slow arithmetic accumulates. A longer break in white whose shoulders curl clean. A persistent tongue of darker, smoother water running outward. A throatier sound where the hiss drops and the pool deepens. Inland, 2 trees, or perhaps a clump of rock and a bush, come into range when you line yourself a little to seaward of the gap. This is not good luck. It is a frequent gift of coastlines with any relief. You mark the alignment, not as fetish, but as one more repeatable you can call back to if you must turn away and try again. Crew rolls compress. The bow watcher takes depth colour, calling deep, deep, shoal, deeper, in a voice that wastes no syllables. 2 hands watch the white on either shoulder. The helmsman repeats the axis you name. 1 person holds a spare sweep ready if the rudder needs a shove. There is no shouting. Years of boring drills have purchased this quiet. Axle grease for a tight moment. You ease sail until the canoe has just enough way to answer the helm. More speed would only make the ebb's friendly hand a shove. The bow slides into the river's darker water. The deck hums as flow quickens under the hull. White teeth to either side chatter and are left astern. The canoe passes the threshold and the song changes. Gust muted, chop, gone, lagoon green lifting like breath held too long. Inside, the star that brought you here becomes memory, not instrument. You say its name anyway, Hokupa, out of habit and gratitude. Then you do what such names require. You move immediately to the order that keeps knowledge alive, sounding pole to confirm what colour suggested. Coral heads given wide berth. Anchor dropped on sand, not thrown. Road paid out, set tested. Lashings checked where a long night may have worried them. A short tally of stores because arrivals can turn into departures faster than pride allows. In the ledger of boring history, this is the line that recurs. Arrival is a beginning. While breakfast eats back the last chill from the watch, you make a record. It is as modest as the watch that earned it. First birds from starboard at grey. Outflow smooth between shoulders. Refraction felt 2 counts before white seam. Range on 2 palms. Ebb mild. If you keep this on wood, you chalk it small. If you carry it in your head, you recite it to someone else so it will not dissolve. Tradition is a series of shared corrections. What the night tried to teach, held in a form the next hands can use. There is, in every arrival, a temptation to turn the night into a story that flatters the teller. You deny yourself that. You keep the focus where your elders kept it, on the system. Hokupa as height check for latitude, east-west runners to bind time, swellers rope when skies blind, house names to keep bearings legible, a landfall triangle to replace hope with geometry, a parallel run to replace hurry with reading, an axis defined by white shoulders and a river's tongue, a canoe trimmed to answer rather than to lunge, short voices, quiet hands, a pot warm where cold burns attention away, a spare in reach where clumsiness will reach it. This is not a tale of a hero star. It is a tale of agreements honoured until an island kept its appointment. Because you are writing for those who value the past, you make a turn inland and show how the night's discipline survives the harbour. A boy stands on a beach at dusk, and a woman with calloused hands lifts his arm and makes him measure, fists from horizon to the patch where north will be. The boy laughs and miscounts. The woman does not scold. She has him do it again from the other side of the canoe shed doorway so he feels how frame changes reference. In a schoolroom, a teacher draws a circle on the floor, divides it into houses, and names them in a language that will be useful on a wet deck as well as in a warm room. In a family courtyard, someone oils a creaking collar, not because they plan to sail that night, but because noisy gear steals stars. None of this earns applause. All of it protects arrival for people whose names will not be written down. You gather small verses the way a net gathers small fish. Low star, slow hand. 2 to choose, 3 to trust. Sky, sea, sail, silence. They are nothing on paper, and everything on the tongue of a tired person at 2 a.m. They give the body a way back to procedure when mood wants noise. You have seen crews who traded verses for swagger. They arrived, but they arrived louder, with lashings burned, tempers raw, and luck debited against the next leg. You prefer crews whose boasts, if they have any, are about tidy coils and unremarkable watches. Every method carries its errors forward unless named. You keep a small catechism near the sweep. What is the loudest lie? That glow on the seam is a star. What is the laziest lie? I can fix a big error with one big correction. What is the proudest lie? Speed proves skill. You teach the counters without heat. Source discipline for the first. Test height, test neighbours. Incremental corrections for the second. Finger widths, not arm swings. Speed discipline for the third. Shorten sail until you can read. Arrive with boat and mind whole. These are not morals. They are repair instructions for the human part of navigation. Near midday, with the canoe snug on her rope, and the lagoon's colour gone leaden under a passing cloud, you speak the plainest sentence you know about Hokupa at these latitudes. It did not get us in. It kept us honest long enough for place to take over. That is the tone you wish to set for those who will tell this voyage later. The star is not a saviour. It is a standard. Standards are humble and hard to love until you see what happens when they are set aside. Afternoon turns to chores that often get cut from stories, and therefore from memory. You repair a nick on the steering paddle where a hurried correction put wood against lashing. You receipt a thole that squealed and stole a glance you needed for a low light. You raise a windward awning in a way that will not bang and make the next watch flinch at shadows. You hang the wet spare bailer where air moves and sun will not split it. You mark the range you used on the reef in a child's mind by walking them to the 2 trees and making them line them up with an outstretched arm. You do these because voyages are not protected by experience alone. They are protected by habits that make experience available at speed. Dusk comes inside the lagoon softer than outside. You keep the reflexes alive. You call the houses once around just to grease the ring in the crew's mouths. You have the bow watcher tell the story of the river tongue between white shoulders so that their voice will know its tone again without searching. You ask the youngest hand to find Hokupa above the palm fronds, and when they cannot, you do not rush. You wait until the air darkens one more shade, and then let the star announce itself. They point, you nod. The ledger gets one more small tick. If this is a story with any claim outside a canoe, it is because of the temperament it teaches. A low, patient star trains a low, patient mind. Measure before you move. Prefer confirmation. Reward small, frequent corrections. Organize your tools. Memorize your rings. Speak little and specifically. Be ready to stop and wait without calling it defeat. These are not only sea virtues. They keep gardens from washing away and storehouses from spoiling and communities from mistaking volume for competence. In that sense, Hokupa is not only a bearing, it is a style. Quiet, conservative, repeatable. Before sleep you strip the lesson down to a final image. A hand lifted in the dark, 2 fists and a little, a shy light just above the seam of sea and sky, a mouth whispering house names, the deck's breath under your feet, a pot warm at your calf, a coiled line nested, a bailer quiet, 3 short words traded between helmsman and bow, the long swell steady as a metronome, the reef's voice rising, then softening, then gone. Inside, lagoon green, and at last a boat that can be let go of the mind. Nothing about it would look impressive in a painting. It would feed the people in the canoe and the people ashore who counted on them. Thought-provoking reflection. If steadiness at sea can be built from one low, easily missed light, plus a handful of practiced phrases and quiet chores, what other work on land, raising children, keeping books, tending soil, speaking truth, might become safer and truer if we let humble checks, small corrections and shared language set our course instead of noise?